Welcome to Scriptural Science, a presentation of Truth and Life Institute, Boston, Massachusetts, and Oba, Nigeria. The following is a subsection of the book. Our universe rotates inside God's mighty hand. Written and published by Ifeanyi Chukwujima, scriptural scientist and a servant of God. This subsection's ID is the universe rotates 1 to 4. God marked off the universe with the breadth of his hand. In Isaiah chapter 40, God establishes for mankind the size of the universe, gives detailed comparisons of the various things he created, and provided comparative sizes of the earth, its continents, the nations of the earth, and their collective size with respect to the universe. God finally concluded in this comparative analysis that all the nations of the world amounted to nothing. He went further to call them collectively less than nothing. In Isaiah 40 verse 12, God talked about the waters of creation, in which the earth sat in Genesis 1 verse 2, being in the hollow of his hand. God then unequivocally declared that no human being has the capacity to measure the extent of the waters because of its astronomical size. Yet the water, in spite of its astronomical size, was contained within a shallow depression on the palm of God's mighty hand, with our huge earth sitting right inside the water in Genesis 1 verse 2. If the all-knowing God knew that someday in the future, he would grant mankind knowledge of science to help humanity understand God's mysteries better, why then would God claim in the book of Isaiah that no one could possibly measure the water in the hollow of his hand? Because God was, and is still, confident that man and all his advances in science and technology to the end of time could not possibly measure that water, because that water in the hollow of God's hand is truly immeasurable. God knew that declarations like this, in the face of the little window of knowledge he had cracked open for mankind, would inflate man's ego and get man fantasizing about bringing God down, just like Satan did and fell. Science would look at the claims in Genesis 1 verses 6 to 8 about God in creating space, pushing the water above the void out of space, and quickly mistaken that to mean the clouds in the sky, in the immediate vicinity of the earth. And because mankind had mistaken that water that was pushed out of space to mean the moisture in the clouds in the earth's sky, mankind, Christians and scientists alike, have dismissed that account of creation as either a metaphor or a flat-out lie, respectively. And as such, mankind had moved on with life, putting that account behind it as just another bogus declaration from the ancient relic that is the Bible. But mankind has greatly erred. That account of water being pushed out of space in Genesis chapter 1 is scientifically accurate and within God's infinity capacity. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that such feat is but the outer fringe of God's works. Job 26 verses 7 to 14. Job 26 verses 7 to 14. Psalm 95 verse 4 also declared that the water of creation in Genesis chapter 1 is physically inside the hand of God. Here is the passage from the Bible, "For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. For in his hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. 5 The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land." Psalm 95 verses 3 to 5. If anyone is confused as to whether verse 4 is talking about the water physically sitting in God's hand or metaphorically saying that God has charge over the water, pay attention to the word hand in that verse. Hand is singular. When something being in someone's hand is used metaphorically, the plural hands is used. Here is one such example from the Bible. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. Luke 23 verse 46. In this passage, Jesus Christ did not physically place his spirit into God's hands, to the extent that any human being can determine or verify. Jesus Christ entrusted his spirit to the care of God. When putting something into the care of another person, or giving someone the authority or privilege to decide on the fate of something, hand is always used as plural hands. But in all the instances where the earth, the universe, and the waters of creation are described in the Bible as being in God's hand is used as singular because the declarations are talking about God's hand as the physical location of the earth, the universe, and the waters of creation. Isaiah 40 verse 12 and Psalms 95 verse 4 are, therefore, stating scientific facts about the physical location of the water of creation in which the earth was submerged in Genesis 1 verse 2. Two-thirds of the earth's surface had been determined to be covered by water, and humanity had very much mapped out the extent of water on the surface of our earth. But the water on the surface of our earth and the moisture in the sky above the earth, which gives rain to the earth, together do not account for the water in the hollow of God's hand that is referenced many times in the Bible. The water we have in our seas and in the moisture in the sky above the earth is just a small fraction of the water in the hollow of God's hand. Because, according to Genesis 1 verses 6 to 8, God, in creating space, pushed more of the water contained in the hollow of his hand beyond the outer limits of space, thus creating space under vacuum. Knowledge of geometry would readily convince anyone that to draw a vacuum within a spherical void, the water on top of the astronomically large sphere called space has to be much larger than the water that remains around the much smaller inner sphere called the Earth. Since the earth inside the water in Genesis 1 verse 2 is infinitesimal in comparison to the space God created within the water in Genesis 1 verses 6 to 8, that is, the water in the hollow of God's hand, we must therefore conclude that the water on top of space is infinitely larger than the water which God left on the earth to become earth seas. And although space was fully formed on day 2 of creation, and the volcanic explosion that created land out of the sea completed on day 3, God out of his own will could still choose to use water elsewhere in the universe to douse volcanic materials into solid planets. Hence the proliferation of planetary systems all over the universe. God created space on day 2. Then on day 3, he formed the universe through a cataclysmic explosion we now dub the Big Bang. In only 24 hours that constituted day 4 of creation, God set the universe in place, Genesis 1 verses 14 to 19. And for the benefit of those who spend endless hours looking around the universe for signs of water outside the earth, all they need to do to find water is to look at the outer perimeter of the universe, and they will blow their minds as to the deluge of water that exists there. Additionally, finding water anywhere else in the universe does not in any way refute anything the Bible says about God's creation activities. Everything man's reason produces is through guesswork, conjectures, and suppositions, none of which our great God has any time for. When he opens his mouth, only the finest word comes out of it and blesses those who give credence to it. At his own choosing, God could have let water get anywhere he so chooses in the universe. As a matter of fact, God could still be using water in the new things he talked about in Isaiah 48 verse 6, Isaiah 4:9. He is God and has absolute freedom to do as he sees fit. Here is God saying it, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that it please. Isaiah 46 verse 10. Isaiah 46 verse 10. And here is the scripture that gave up its scientific secrets, now that the world's scientific advancements have enhanced humanity's ability to understand what God is proclaiming in these verses. That the entire universe and all of its contents, including the earth and mankind, is sitting in God's hand and squarely supported, monitored, and controlled by that mighty hand of God. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and he rules with a mighty arm. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense accompanies him. 11. He tends his flock like a shepherd. 12. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales, and the hills in a balance? Isaiah 40 verses 10 to 12. Surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. 16 Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. 17 Before him all the nations are as nothing, they are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. Isaiah 40 verses 15 to 17. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the founded? 22 He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. Isaiah 40 verses 21 to 22. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal? Says the Holy One. 26 Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Isaiah 40 verses 25 to 26. The breadth of God's hand is a measurement and not a measuring tool. God's two hands are the most effective and most precise tools anyone could employ in any project of any size. So when Isaiah 40 verse 12 states that God, with the breadth of his hand, marked off the heavens being the universe. The passage is giving you a total measurement and not simply talking about a measuring tool that was used an unlimited number of times to establish a measurement. He is God, so he could easily give himself whatever he wanted. It was only in primitive times that even the human beings used the breadth of their hands, the length of their foot, and their strides to make measurements. Mankind had since moved on to tape measures, lengthy rolls of tapes, rollers with counters, lasers, and other more intricate computing means like the speed of light to determine huge distances. Therefore, if human beings have been able to make this much stride in their measuring techniques, how much more could God have done? The God who created the most wonderful things that exist anywhere? It would be timid for the awesome God who made the entire universe and the most formidable forces anywhere to resort to counting off the breadth of his hand to measure out anything he wants to build. Mankind in their improvement of their measuring techniques had to grow and mature as they went from one improvement to another. But the all-knowing God was perfection right from the very beginning, and as such could not have resorted to making crude measurements. So what this passage from the book of Isaiah was talking about is the entire measurement of the universe, and not an instrument of measurement that was counted off an infinite number of times. Take a look at the Bible's description of God's measurement when God created the earth. Keep in mind that God created the foundations of the earth prior to day 1 of creation, and land and sea on day 3 of creation. So, is it possible that the same God who talked about using measuring line across the earth to establish the dimensions of the earth, Job 38 verse 5, which is very tiny in comparison with the expansive universe, would suddenly resort to a much cruder method of measurement in establishing the dimensions of the universe, which is infinitely larger and more complex than the earth? Impossible. Our God does not regress. He is perfection through and through. Here is the passage from the Bible. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me 6 on what were its footing set, or who laid its cornerstone. 7 while the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Job 38 verses 4 to 7. Therefore, Isaiah 40 verse 12 establishes that the entire universe was designed to fit into God's mighty hand and be eternally supported by his hand. And that being the case, how big then is our God? This finally paints a picture for mankind about the unimaginable size of our God, the God who has chosen to make us his children and shower us with his endless love. Not only did he build a special place called the earth for us, enamored with everything necessary to keep all mankind in safety, he also went out of his way to put us in his eternal will, not because of our own self-importance, because we measure up to nothing, but because of his great love for mankind. So when Isaiah 40 verse 17 proclaims as follows, "Before him all the nations are as nothing, they are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing," it was not God talking about mankind in a derogatory way because he was angry at mankind. Calling all the nations of the world, collectively, nothing was simply God establishing a scientific fact, because in the arithmetic of scales, all of humanity, and all the nations of the world and all they possess physically amount to nothing. And truer still, mankind and all amount to less than nothing, and God was sure to state it that way. This further establishes the fact that God is doing everything that He is doing with mankind out of His immense love for mankind, and not because mankind amounts to anything. Why, then, do we have difficulty reciprocating that love by obeying the commands of God? Additionally, we can see why nobody has been able to see God. God placed the humongous universe between Himself and our beloved earth, the same earth which we are unfortunately bent on destroying out of greed. Also, with God seated at His throne outside our universe and being as big as He is, with the entire universe sitting on His hand, no human effort could get us to where God is. And nothing we do on this earth could affect Him in any way, shape, or form. Only our obedience to His commands would achieve anything for any of us. And it is not too late to start now. The new revelation contained in this book is extremely bad news for those who are in great hurry to remove the name of God in everything in our society. At the same time, it is extremely good news for those who desire God's love and obey His commands. I am personally elated, and all mankind should be too. Look at the following passage from the book of Job, Job 26 verses 7 to 14, for more details on God's creation activities. Also see the inserted references from Genesis chapter 1. 1 Job 26 verse 7 to 14 dissected. Job 26 verses 7 to 14. He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. Genesis 1 verses 6 to 8, he suspends T. 10. He marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a bounder works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Job 26 verses 7 to 14. And to support the creation account of Genesis chapter 1 about the earth being created before the universe, look at the following passage from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 8 verse 23 declares about wisdom, the first of all of God's works. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning, when the world came to be. Proverbs 8 verse 23. Let us break it down mathematically so we can gain a better understanding of what the passage, Proverbs 8 verse 23, is saying. Long ages ago equals before all creation, as can be seen in Proverbs 8 verse 24. And at the very beginning equals when the world came to be. It does not get any clearer than that. The beginning of the world, earth, was the beginning of the earth, the universe, and everything in nature. And the writer of Proverbs was sure to take us through the entire creation in the same very order things happened in Genesis chapter 1. Following this opening statement in verse 23 about the very beginning, when the world came to be, verse 24, 25, and 26 recount the watery depth of before time, Genesis 1 verse 2, then on to the springs, the mountains, the hills, and the fields of day 3 of creation, Genesis 1 verse 9 and Genesis 2 verse 6. Verse 27 and 28 then talk about the creation of the universe, Genesis 1 verses 14 to 19, the marking off of the horizon on the face of the deep for boundary between light and darkness, the establishment of the cloud in reference to the moon and the other celestial bodies, and the establishment of the clouds above the earth for rain cycles for the replenishment of the sea, referred to in the passage as the securing the fountains of the sea. God holding the entire dust of the earth in a basket indicates how really small the earth is as compared to some significantly larger creation of God that is referred to here as a basket. God weighing the mountains of the earth on the scales and the hills of the earth in a balance indicates that God knows exactly how much they collectively constitute as, measured against everything else God created. But the ancients had no way of knowing that these declarations are literal and not metaphors. The ancients could see the sky, but had no way of knowing about the existence of other planets in our solar system, much less the nature of our expansive universe. But now, science and technology have provided mankind with the knowledge that permits us to put these things in perspective as we are doing in this book. And this should only be the beginning. Theology has to embrace the knowledge of science and astronomy for a better understanding of God's truth in real terms. God then talked about all the nations of the earth, collectively, as amounting only to a single drop into a bucket. And what is that bucket in which this drop is dropped into? The universe. Therefore, the earth and all its inhabitants and their collective wealth and civilization, as compared to a huge bucket that is the universe, amounts only to the size of a tiny drop of water set in the middle of the expansive universe. The insignificant size of the earth and all of its nations and their peoples and wealth and civilization are regarded as a single particle of dust on God's scale of measurement, which God uses to measure all created things, up to and including the universe itself. And these measuring capabilities are all within God. God does not need tools to create. This is why God forbade his people never to use any tools in constructing anything dedicated to God. Exodus 20, verse 25, and other places in the Bible. All the continents on the earth are described in Isaiah 40, verse 15 as islands because they appear that way from space, let alone from God's vantage point, higher up beyond our universe. And these continents put together are regarded by God as though they were fine dust. That is, taken together, they appear as though they are a minute particle of dust. Isaiah 40, verse 16 brought that comparison even closer for those who in ancient times did not have our knowledge of space and the universe. The passage talked about the entire country of Lebanon with its extensive priced timber not being enough for one altar fire, and all the animals in the ancient lush wilderness of Lebanon not being enough for burnt offerings to God at his throne in heaven. These descriptions are also meant to convey to humanity that nothing we can offer to God, out of our individual wealth, could meet God's criteria of a sacrifice in any way. That what God demanded from the ancient Israelites for sacrifice and still demands from believers today is a token designed by God to compel everyone to show his or her gratitude to God on a regular basis. This passage from Isaiah concluded by declaring that all of the earth, its people, and their collective wealth and civilization measure on God's scale of measurement as nothing, or more accurately put, less than nothing. Is that assessment not truly a good comparison between the earth and everything in it, including mankind, to the rest of the expansive universe? On a real scale of measurement, mankind and everything mankind brings to the table equate to less than nothing and could easily be discounted without anyone noticing that something is missing. And according to physics, the size of dust particles varies from about half a micrometer, 0.00002 in, to several times this size. http://hypertextbook.com/facts/2003/marinabiolotovsky.html http. In more familiar terms, 0.00002 in or zero point 0.5 micrometer is 2/10, 0.000, 2 portions out of 10,000 divisions of 1 inch. This is the size of our entire Earth from this comparative analysis by God of our Earth with respect its importance on a scale on which the universe is also weighed. Below is an internet excerpt describing the different stages in the formation of a raindrop. God makes the rain, and when the passage in Isaiah talks about all the nations of the world collectively being like a drop in a bucket, raindrop could not be far from the drop the passage was referring to. So let us look at the various sizes of raindrop and their stages of formation from this short excerpt. 1. Why raindrops are different sizes. In science, we learn that one question often leads to another or several others. Before we can discuss raindrop sizes, we must understand what a raindrop is. How is a raindrop made? How big can a raindrop be? In order to have rain, you must have a cloud. A cloud is made up of water in the air, water vapor. Along with this water are tiny particles called condensation nuclei, for instance, the little pieces of salt left over after seawater evaporates, or a particle of dust or smoke. Condensation occurs when the water vapor wraps itself around the tiny particles. Each particle, surrounded by water, becomes a tiny droplet between. 0.0001 and 0.005 centimeter in diameter. The particles range in size, therefore, the droplets range in size. However, these droplets are too light to fall out of the sky. How will they get big enough to fall? Picture a huge room full of tiny droplets milling around. If one droplet bumps into another droplet, the bigger droplet will eat the smaller droplet. This new bigger droplet will bump into other smaller droplets and become even bigger. This is called coalescence. Soon the droplet is so heavy that the cloud, or the room, can no longer hold it up and it starts falling. As it falls, it eats up even more droplets. We can call the rowing droplet a raindrop as soon as it reaches the size of 0.5 millimeters in diameter or bigger. If it gets any larger than 4 millimeters, however, it will usually split into two separate drops. The raindrop will continue falling until it reaches the ground. As it falls, sometimes a gust of wind, updraft, will force the drop back up into the cloud where it continues eating other droplets and getting bigger. When the drops finally reach the ground, the biggest drops will be the ones that bumped into and coalesced with the most droplets. The smaller drops are the ones that didn't run into as many droplets. Raindrops are different sizes for two primary reasons. 1. Initial differences in particle, condensation nuclei, size, 2. Different rates of coalescence. This information is courtesy of the University of Idaho. http://water.usgs.gov/edu/raindropsizes.html. http. In conclusion, raindrop ranges from 0.5 millimeter to 4.0 millimeter. The particular size the passage in Isaiah was referring to, we do not know, but it is certainly within the range of 0.5 to 4.0 millimeter. Half a millimeter is equal to 0.0197 inch. That is approximately 0.02 inch, which is one portion out of 50 divisions of 1 inch. And bucket sizes are wide and varied. So, with the bucket in this narrative representing the universe, and the drop representing the earth, with all of its inhabitants and their earthly possessions and know-how, the passage's comparison hits the mark. This comparison was designed to convey that the universe and its contents and treasures far outsizes the earth and all of the earth's contents and treasures. Therefore, Isaiah chapter 40 was designed by God to give humanity a good reveal into the science of everything. Up until now, this chapter of Isaiah and others similar to it in the Bible had sounded like an angry rebuke from God to mankind, when in reality it is all scientific facts with the highest precision. Designed by God to give mankind unobstructed peek into God's creations, His love for mankind and His wonderment, so that mankind would be persuaded into readily becoming compliant with the commands of God in the Bible. What God had designed to show love has been mistaken for angry talk by the world and has been used by the majority of the world to bash God and defame His mighty name. And while this was happening, humanity then ran off into uncharted territory, cooking up lies and masking its lies with exotic mathematical formulas and unfounded theories, and has been receiving glory for them. Following is a passage from Proverbs chapter 8, part of which was referenced above to further support the order of creation as God laid out in Genesis chapter 1. Proverbs 8 verses 22 to 31. The Lord brought me forth as the first of His works, before His deeds of oh yes. The world began at all, 24, when there were no watery depths. I was given birth. Genesis 1 verse 2, when there were no springs overflowing with water. Genesis 2 verse 6 and Genesis 1 verses 9 to 10. 25, before the mountains were settled in place. Genesis 1 verses 9 to 10. Job 38 verse 14, before the hills. I was given birth. Genesis 1 verses 9 to 10 and Job 38 verse 14. 26, before He made the world or its fields. Genesis 1 verse 9-10, or any of the dust of the earth. Genesis 1 verse 2, 27, I was there when He set the heavens in place. Genesis 1 verses 14 to 19, when He marked out the hoary. With the Trinity, 31, rejoicing in His whole world, wisdom belongs with the Trinity. Figure 1. Heaven and earth configuration at Genesis 1 verses 2 to 5, not drawn to scale. God's glorious radiance filled the entire God's dwelling place, heaven, and, to a modified capacity, the surface of the earth/water, to create the day and night configuration that God desired to create on the earth, and maintained on the earth through the end of time, at which point the earth will be completely covered 24/7, without nights, and into eternity, with God's direct radiance.